Dr. Freedman, siz birinchilardan bo'lib, ekojurnalistikaga ta'rif bergan insonsiz. Ayni paytda butun dunyoda ekojurnalistikaning rivojlanish tendensiyalari nimada ko'rinadi?
What I'm seeing in climate change plays a major role in this is an awareness in regions and countries that didn't pay any attention to environmental problems. It doesn't always mean that there's environmental journalism, but it always means that there are environmental stories that should be covered. Let me give you two examples. We're in the United States. We have our own access to information. We have journalists who work for news organizations and freelancers who often have some background in science. They have some background in journalism, and they have a passion for the topic. For a comparison, they're like sports reporters. Mm-hmm. They're just basketball or hockey. And what's happened is American and other Western journalists have been covering some of these issues in areas where the local journalists can't or won't or don't have the resources to cover, but that's not reporting for the people who are affected, whether it's Uzbekistan or North Korea or any place. And so in some ways that's good for the world, but it's not necessarily prompting action by governments, by NGOs, by citizens in countries, because if you don't know the problem, you're not going to push to solve it. And the problems are more and more and more complex. Trying to explain climate change, even in the US, is difficult. I tell my students, they say, I want to do a story on climate change. That would be a reporter going to an editor and saying, I want to do a story on poverty or war. Well, we write little pieces of this at a time, and we hope that those little pieces are reflected in an understanding of the bigger. So if it's a story about poverty, we write about one poverty program or one family or one research study. We don't write about the US government is trying to solve poverty. And environment, we see these stories in climate change. We can talk about how a particular species in our state is disappearing or moving. We can talk about how farmers have longer growing seasons, which is good for some crops, but not for others. We can show them visually the shoreline of the Great Lakes as the water levels rise and fall. And we can take historic photos and satellite photos now and go like...
Uzbekistan universitetlarida ekojurnalistika alohida yo'nalish sifatida ko'rilmaydi, faqatgina fan sifatida, kichkina fan sifatida o'tiladi. Michigan universitetida alohida ekojurnalistika bo'yicha yo'nalish bormi?
Within our School of Journalism, we have a center. It's called the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism, and it was established with a grant from a foundation, Newspaper Family Foundation. And we have 3 full-time faculty, and we have students who work for us. We have master's and PhD students we work with. But our mission is 3 major parts. One is we teach courses, environmental reporting classes, graduate seminars on journalism covering science, health, and environment. Second thing, we do traditional academic research, and we also do some of our own reporting for environmental publications or for general news organizations, like news services and newspapers. And then the third thing we do is training of journalists and journalism students outside our university. For example, we have just completed a project. It had to be Zoom and remote because of COVID, but working with Peruvian journalists and universities on how to cover environmental issues. We did a 10-day training in Chile a few years ago on that. And we're now working with another university on training science faculty of color in how to explain their research. So it's training of journalists and training of scientists to talk to us. We were talking before, so if you're a wildlife biologist, you write an article, it's published in a journal, and the only other people who will see it are other wildlife biologists, and the only other people who will read it and pay any attention are other wildlife biologists. But often those studies are newsworthy, the findings, particularly when they come to things like endangered species, habitat destruction, extinction. There's wide public interest, but they don't know what the scientists are doing because reporters aren't looking, and reporters, if they do look, don't look deep enough. And then we do some other things. We have some programs where we work with secondary schools. We do collaborative research with people at other universities on environmental and science topics. There are a few other programs like ours. There's one at the University of Colorado, and then there are environmental journalism classes, but not centers or formal programs at many universities. And they might be 1 or 2 classes that they offer.
So'ramoqchi edimki, masalan, jurnalistlar asosan birorta bir yirik eko muammo paydo bo'lgandagina O'zbekistonda mana shu muammoga ko'proq e'tibor qaratishadi. Kichkina ekologik muammolarga e'tibor qaratishmaydi, ammo mana shu kichkina ekologik muammolardan katta muammolar kelib chiqadi. Aynan bu borada amerikalik jurnalistlarning pozitsiyasi qanaqa?
We have both. We have journalists who cover environment, but they also might cover police. They're in small news organizations. They might cover education. And let's say there is a dam that collapses, or there's a wildfire. Today they'll be covering the wildfire. Tomorrow the dam. The day after they're covering the school election. There are news organizations that are national, everything from National Geographic, both television and the magazine, to the New York Times and the Washington Post and Associated Press, that have full-time and sometimes several reporters who cover environment or environment and health or environment and science. And then there are the specialized news organizations. There's one that's called E&E. It's a newswire, energy and environment. It's based in Washington. It has correspondents all over the country. It's a nonprofit news model. I do some freelancing for a magazine called Earth Island Journal. It's published by a nonprofit in California, and it looks at environmental issues. It's more feature stories. Some are investigative, but it's a popular audience of people who are interested in environmental things. I think a lot of the education that journalists do to the public is not in a big magazine like National Geographic. It's by articles in their local paper or the TV station, or they're posted on the website from their community news organization. And that's what exposes them to the local context of these issues.
Yana savolim bor edi. Global iqlim o'zgarishi hozir butun dunyoni qamrab oldi, ammo global iqlim o'zgarishi borasidagi kelishuvga Amerika qo'shilmagan edi. Siz buni qanday baholaysiz?
Well, first of all, it was a political decision. It wasn't motivated by science. It wasn't motivated by the economic cost of compliance. And what happened was a number of individual states or cities decided they would voluntarily follow those standards. Now, we had a new president. We belong to these kinds of multinational efforts. 2 years from now, there may be a different president, maybe someone who pulls out again. And it's not based on the science. We do have people, including some politicians, who claim this is all a hoax. There's no such thing. Over millions of years, the environment has changed, which is true. but the human contribution and the human speeding up of the process is the only thing we have any control over. We have a congressional election coming on Tuesday. Right now, the Democrats narrowly control our Congress. The polls indicate that that won't be the case after January 1st, based on this election. What that means is that it would be harder for President Biden and his relevant agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Agriculture, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, be harder for them to implement policies that have been recently passed, and it'll be harder for them to keep funding, because Congress is the ones that take out the wallet and puts the money on the table. So if a Republican Congress doesn't want to provide as much funding for the National Park Service, the president can't write his own check. And so for many environmentalists, that's a frightening thought. And if it happens, then the ramifications for everybody are significant. If the government is not monitoring atmospheric precipitation changes, then agriculture, farmers can't plan in the long term. Are they going to move their farms? Are they going to put in irrigation systems? Are they going to change their crops? So it's not just politics in Washington by itself in a bubble. It's politics that has an actual impact on individuals and businesses.
Yanımda savolim. Aynan shu ekojurnalistikada sizda nima o'ziga tortadi? Nima uchun ekojurnalistika bilan shug'ullanasiz?
I would not, when I started my reporting career, I was primarily covering legal issues. I had gone to law school, and so I was covering courts, trials, law enforcement issues, and then I started covering state governments, first in New York and then in Michigan. And there's much more public policy there, so some of the things that I was doing were still legal, but others dealt with government agencies, and I began doing more environmental stories. I'm not a scientist. I took science classes in secondary school, a little bit at university, but I'm by no means a scientist. I'm interested in environmental policies, how they're made, how they're implemented. I'm interested in environmental litigation, lawsuits, how the courts are used to advance or to block environmental initiatives. I don't really know much about nuclear power. I don't know much about fossil fuels. I know a little, but I know a lot about public lands and parks. I know a lot about wildlife. I know a lot about illegal trafficking in plants and animals. I know a lot about community involvement in environmental issues, because those are the things that, because I still do writing, that I like to write about. And I have that luxury of doing that. But we need this journalists who can write about nuclear power and about the technical parts of fossil fuels. We need those who are located in places where they can go out. You asked me what I like about environmental journalism. If you're doing the job right, you're not just sitting in your office or your house all day and on the phone all day. You're going out, you're seeing things. I do that with my students. A few weeks ago, I took my students to a landfill, the largest one in our area, and we had somebody give us a tour and explain the whole system and what goes in and what goes out, and the way that the land it's sealed off so it won't contaminate. I take my students sometimes to the pathology lab for the State Department of Natural Resources, where they cut the animals open because they're checking for diseases. I take them sometimes to a power plant on campus that used to be coal, then it was mixed, and now it's all natural gas. I've taken them to a wildlife center where they can talk to a wildlife biologist. They can walk around outside. I took my students to one of the Great Lakes a few weeks ago, and we met with people involved in the cleanup of a contaminated river. We met with a state expert on invasive species, and we met with somebody familiar with the fishing industry. So these are face-to-face, boots-on-the-ground things that environmental reporters should love to do. It helps us describe, we get pictures, we get video, but we also get a deeper understanding. You can, when we were at the Great Lakes at Lake Huron, we walked with some people from the activist group. There's a 1 mile long path along the river. It used to be an industrial railroad, and they're explaining the native plants there, they're pulling out the invasives, saving some of the historic artifacts. They pointed where kids go swimming where 10 years ago your skin could peel off, or you swallow that water and you would get sick. And it's much easier for us to talk about it, broadcast, online, print, if we see it rather than somebody describes it to us. And I like getting outdoors, and it's a way to do it and feel that it's helping me professionally. Well, I don't know what the laws are here. In the United States, if you're an NGO, environmental NGO, you basically have two choices. One choice is to be tax exempt. That means people who give you money can get a credit on their income taxes. So it's a big incentive. Or you can be classified a different way. You're still an NGO, but you can lobby. So if you're in the first category, you can't go and testify in front of Congress every 2 weeks. You can't give political contributions, because then you lose this special tax-protected status. In some countries, like, and I think here, for what I know, NGOs are trying to do something that the national government isn't doing. And I don't know that national governments in general like to give up power. Anybody who has power wants to keep power. And anybody who's trying to run for office is trying to get power to keep power. And governments, it could be a liberal government like Sweden or Denmark. It could be, well, Turkmenbashi is different, but it could be a really repressive regime, or any place in between. And if what the people in power think the NGOs are doing threatens their power in some way, they have two choices. One is to change their policies in response, and I'll give you an example in a minute, or it's to make it difficult for the NGOs to operate, whether it's licensing or it's taxes. Sometimes these do lead to change, and we see that where a community group that becomes a local NGO is pressing the city council to clean up a dump, for a landfill, for example. Big federal government, we have states and we have cities and towns and local boards. So if we have a planning board in my town, and if there's a proposal for a new apartment development or a new store, there are people who will go to the planning board meetings to oppose it, or to ask questions about, is there going to be green space? Is it going to add traffic? So the process is open. The planning board can hear people. Anybody can go. You don't need to be representing an NGO, but you could be. You could be the local chapter of the Sierra Club that is concerned about a plan that's going to damage a park. And what the people who come to the meetings and the hearings, they don't always get the result they want, but at least they have a sense that somebody listened and the process worked. If you have a system where all decisions are made behind closed doors by administrators and bureaucrats, and politicians and the ministers, then NGOs have a different situation because you can't open that locked door. Somebody who's in there may tell you afterwards this is what happened, and then there would be an announcement about approval of a project. And I don't have any solutions to that. I have enough trouble dealing with the complexities in my country, let alone in other countries. But what I see as an outsider is that there are so many environmental issues, environmental problems in Uzbekistan that any kind of advocacy or investigation by NGOs or groups of citizens are valuable. And journalists play an important role in reporting that the community went to the Hakimiyat to complain about something. But there aren't that many journalists. You're among the exceptions who do that systematically. There's what I found in earlier study, I looked at Fergana Valley and whether journalists in the three countries cooperated with each other because water or the availability of water or whether deforestation is going to get. The water and wind don't look at the political map. And journalists on this side of the border are dealing with, or could be dealing with, exactly the same questions as those a few kilometers away, separated by an artificial line. And it makes it difficult because if you're a journalist in Kyrgyzstan and you want information from an agency in Uzbekistan, if you have no relationship, they're not going to talk to you. Maybe they won't talk to this person either, but at least this person will understand the system. But some of the issues, the uranium tailings in Kyrgyzstan, well, the water flows in the wrong direction for Uzbekistan. Or the aluminum plant in Tajikistan, and the air quality comes, the poor air comes in. People in Uzbekistan have to move because it's dangerous to their health. Cities, I understand the city has a problem with illegal cutting of trees because there's all this development. There's impact of deforestation and the legacy, the environmental legacy of the Aral Sea and the respiratory problems caused by all those dried up chemicals from pesticides. So there's a lot out there to be reported on, and part of that reporting is the science, part of it's the policy, and part of it is the human impact and whether local people and local groups are trying to change policy or influence decisions that are often made hundreds of miles away in the capital.